Hello everyone. Welcome to another episode of Chatter. Today, I am delighted to be joined by Matt Lohmeier, consultant, public speaker, author, and former Space Force commander. Matt, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, not a problem. It's a pleasure. So, as I briefly sort of alluded to in the intro, you are author of Irresistible Revolution, Marxism Goal of Conquest: The Unmaking of the American Military. I saw the title and was immediately like, I need to read this book. It's definitely provocative as a title. So why don't you start with maybe when you first decided you were gonna write a book? Like, because there's always like a moment. Everyone has like a that. Okay, right. This is it. I have to write about this. Like, when was yours?
So, yeah, it's a great question. I've teased in the past that you have to, I guess, maybe be odd or a little bit out of your mind if you really genuinely want to write a book. But I suppose there are authors in the world, and I don't consider myself one of them. And so I didn't have the ambition to write a book, but I was in command in the Space Force and was in charge of our nation's space-based missile warning efforts, which are done, at least from a ground perspective, out of Buckley Air Force Base in Colorado. And I was encountering political activism in a way that I hadn't seen before in the armed forces at my base, and learned that this was a much more widespread problem than I was encountering just at my base alone. And that is not what led me to want to write a book. It was what led me to want to try and fix that problem, because anyone who's spent any time in the military or who's thought about it before appreciates that you don't exactly want an overtly partisan workplace in the U.S. military, or any military for that matter, that you hope to maintain unity and cohesion and morale and all those kinds of things. And so I set about trying to provide some feedback to my chain of command all the way up to the very top. Had phone conversations with senior leaders and expressed my concern about what that was really doing to the morale of the military workplace. They agreed with me that it was a big problem, but in a nutshell, I could say that we'd created a climate for ourselves in which it made it difficult for them to hold political activists accountable for their activism. This was all in the aftermath of George Floyd's death. It was a very active season in the Western world for Antifa, Black Lives Matter, and other social justice activism, of course. We saw a lot of that in the headlines in the news. And that rendered senior military leaders rather impotent, in my view, to take action when someone was acting unethically or illegally in the uniform. And so I filed a formal written complaint, and that was later dismissed without even an investigation. And it wasn't like it wasn't well documented. It was very well documented that there was illegal discrimination and conduct. And so my thought was, and this is the answer to your question, if I can't solve these problems using the apparatus that's available to me in the military, specifically the chain of command, the inspector general channels and whatnot, then probably there's nothing like embarrassment that gets the Defense Department in the USA moving quickly. And so I thought I'd write a book about it, which was a daunting consideration because, like I said, I didn't want to do that. But I spent the next 4 months writing the book. I had already studied the topic of Marxist revolutions and saw the stink of Marxism all over what was currently happening in the West. And so it didn't arise over. It appeared to the lay citizen as if it had come up overnight, but it hadn't. It had been around a while, and so I was wanting to trace the ideological roots of what we were seeing. Wrote the book and was fired for it the next week after publishing the book and speaking about it on a podcast. I was fired and didn't recover my military career after that. So I've been speaking and consulting with members of the military ever since.
Yeah, I didn't realize it was literally a week after
It
you.
was.
Wow, I didn't realize quite that soon. That's stunning. So
Well, I
yeah.
had let me clarify that I was fired from my command the week after I had published the book, but I was in the military still. I was still a lieutenant colonel. They don't just take all of that from you right away, but I was relieved of my command, which meant I was no longer in that position of trust. And they let me know when they fired me that they had lost their trust. No, they didn't say this when they fired me. They let the world know in a press release that they had. It was an article. I mean, it was essentially a hit piece, but that they had orchestrated, they being the Space Force, with military.com. And the next morning, I read in military.com that they had lost their trust and confidence in me as a leader. That's what they said in print. Well, that kind of damages your reputation a bit. And frankly, it wasn't true that they'd lost their trust and confidence in me. They were trying to cover their necks. And so I can say that with some certainty, although I'm sure they didn't like what I had done. I think they trusted that I would always try and do the right things in leadership and in command. So I was under investigation for about 3 months after that. And it was after that investigation that they pretended to make that I wasn't found guilty of anything. I separated from the military without pay. And after 15 and a half years of service, just transitioned into civilian life and kept speaking out about these things, which, as we were talking about before we started recording, isn't necessarily what I study with every waking hour of my life, but I happen to know something about it, so I'm out speaking about it.
Yeah, well, I mean, the world needs more people like yourself willing to say something. I there's it's actually a theme that I've noticed amongst people who choose to stand up and say what they believe to be is like a truth that the world needs to hear, is that quite often they're reluctant, or at least the ones that I've spoken to, they tend to be quite reluctant in coming forward. But yeah, much respect for you for
Oh, thanks.
taking
Yeah,
those.
we need people to speak up. Yeah,
Yeah,
you're right.
and honestly, that's really the only, I think, probably the only way that the world gets fixed.
Mhm.
There isn't many better ways to change the world than speaking the truth. So to that end, you have decided to write the book. So we'll get into the more interesting and
Yeah.
esoteric things, I'm sure, later on, because there's a couple of questions I want to
All
ask
right.
you that will go down that road. But um, regarding the book and yeah, you're spotting the signs of Marxisms, like of Marxism, sorry. Like, could you delineate a little bit, like, what the signs that you had identified, and what are these like red flags that you were seeing that you believe to be like insidious signs of Marxism?
Right. Okay. Um, I'm going to give an explanation that I know is that can appear simplistic, although it is not overly simplistic, and it's true. And people are beginning to realize precisely what this is. But I'll give this explanation with the understanding that Marxism, of course, has more political and economic nuance than I'm going to employ in my explanation. Okay. But what I meant by a Marxist rooted critical race theory, for example, that's a phrase I use in my book, or a Marxist impulse. It's the oppressor versus oppressed narrative of human affairs that is prevalent in Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels' 1848 Communist Manifesto, and that has typified Marxist revolutions all over the world. Whether you're talking about the proletariat or the bourgeoisie classes, for example, which is more of an economic class stratification and struggle, or you're talking race relations, the black versus the white, oppressor, or I'm sorry, in this case, I should say white versus black, oppressor versus oppressed group stratification. It's identity politics. And so, again, forgive the what is apparently an overly simplistic description, but it is what I meant when I say in the subtitle that you read, Marxism's goal of conquest and the unmaking of the American military. There was something afoot, anew in the military, that was race identity politics, which is, by the way, at least in the United States, the most powerful narrative you can seize upon in order to divide people and to group people into oppressor versus oppressed groups. It strikes at the core of our founding principles, equality and justice. Men are created equal. those are things that people in the West very much believe in. And if you're an American, you very much believe in the ideas of equality and justice. I would say if you had some philosophical nuance, I'd say within bounds, you believe in equality. But um, the goal of the Marxist, um, this necessarily brings up questions about whether or not they know they're purveyors of Marxist thought. I get it, and I've been over this ground. The goal of the Marxist ideologue, the true believer, and the Marxist revolutionary, and so a great example of this is the Black Lives Matter organizers. They were admitted overt Marxist organizers. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. That's something they've said publicly a number of times, and now it's abundantly clear. Is to create sufficient strife and division and group identities, tribes, that people will have enough animosity towards one another that they will deem it necessary to create an uprising or a violent revolution and to throw off the incumbent government and establish something new in its place. That something new is the establishment of the communist state. And there's, of course, different degrees of socialism, but the communist state is indeed the end goal. And there's, again, I want to be very clear about that. Anyone who knows what they're talking about understands this. So, in order for freedom or liberty to abound, individualism must be highly regarded, and better put, the rights of the individual must be respected. And what I mean by that, those principles or ideas are defined in the Declaration of Independence. They're not defined, but they're specified, at least in part, in the Declaration of Independence. The ideas of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and originally in some of the states' constitutions, the right to property. Those things come under attack immediately. All of those things in Marxist thought. In fact, they come under attack in 1848 when Marx and Engels write the manifesto. It's an attack on the capitalist West, on property, on the bourgeoisie class. And, we've heard this same sentiment expressed by the World Economic Forum and some of the elite. It's this idea that you'll own nothing and you'll be happy with it. You'll be happy about it. And those ideas are not compatible with American founding values. Now, it might be very well what America becomes if we pursue that path. That would be unfortunate. But Marxism is the ideological precursor to violent revolution that is intended to prepare the way for the communist state. And it devalues and de-emphasizes and disrespects the individual in favor of the community and the state. And of course, that isn't brought about by free will or of one's own volition, but by state force or compulsion or coercion. And it is quite totalitarian in spirit. And we've seen some of that manifest then, back to your question, what is it exactly that I meant? When people are forcing others to apologize for their privilege, their white privilege, when there's an insistence that because someone is in a privileged status, they are therefore ipso facto the oppressor class, and all of that is Marxist. And before that, before there was ever a Karl Marx, it wasn't Marxist because there was no Marx, but it was the same thing. It was the same spiritual impulse. And Jordan Peterson recently, someone pointed this out to me, and I haven't listened to his podcast, but he calls it the spirit of Cain from what he'd call the Bible or Genesis creation myth. It is this idea that the adversary comes whispering in one's ear and says, hey, you've been dealt with unjustly. You've been treated unfairly, and someone else has taken what rightly belongs to you, and you can use violence to take that back and get it for yourself. And then after he commits the act of violence, Cain exclaims, surely my brother's flocks fall into my hands. He's finally achieved the thing he was looking for, and it's through hatred and violence. And so that's what I meant when I was talking about the Marxist impulse.
Okay, so just to kind of make sure I've got everything here that you said. So essentially, the thing that you've honed in on like amongst others, but is this idea of like the division of society or any organization into two classes of people, like the oppressor and the oppressed. And you were seeing examples of that and expressed like people have to apologize for their privilege, whether that I'm
Oh,
not sure.
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's the expression of this like Marxist red flag that you spotted.
Yeah, right. I guess I didn't really tell you how it was manifesting in the military, but
Yeah.
yeah, that's what I meant by the Marxist impulse.
Mm-hmm.
Now, people may or may not have heard of a great example of this kind of impulse being woven into the fabric of a telling of history would be Nicole Hannah Jones' New York Times 1619 Project, for example. Now, she's just the lead, maybe senior editor, if that was her title or role. There were other journalists. And if you read it, it's a compilation of essays. It came out, I don't know if it's been 5 years now. Maybe it was 2018 or 2019 when it came out. But in writing my book, I thought 2019. Okay. In writing my book, I thought, I got to read that whole thing. So I got an online copy and nice color PDF of the entire project and read through the essays. I've quoted examples of the kind of ideologically rooted rhetoric that appears in those essays that seek to overemphasize certain ugly aspects of American history with the intent to create an entirely new narrative, a revisionist narrative of American history and its affairs. Now, what's powerful about it is that you can't write such a history without relying on facts and truth to some degree, because it's truth that has staying power, convincing power, that is appealing to people. You have to weave in the facts. And so they've done that by telling stories about American history, factual stories, more or less, with an ideological fabric that they've used as the backdrop for those stories. And what's quite telling about that project in particular is that if you want to talk from an American perspective, the two major political parties, Democrats and Republicans, they have historians that do incredibly different types of historical work on both sides of the political aisle, and both sides of the aisle have come out condemning that project as not history, but pure ideology, which tells you something about it. If Democrats are willing to come out, for example, and say, hey, look, we're not even the conservative ones, but this is disgusting. It's meant to tear down and destroy. It's not meant to teach anything, right? And so my base commander, for example, was teaching the troops at his base talking points that come right out of that kind of ideological framework about American history. Now, here's why this is a tremendous problem for a military. When a young man or woman shows up to put on the same uniform and to join the military, they swear an oath to support and defend the Constitution against its enemies, both foreign and domestic. And then at some point in their career, they grapple with, what does it mean to support and defend the Constitution against its enemies, both foreign and domestic? Well, one of the things I point out in my book is that Nicole Hannah Jones and the journalists at the New York Times seem to me to be the purveyors of an anti-American, anti-Constitution, an anti-declaration, anti-American founders, anything you can think early American. They're a force of anti-Americanism in the rhetoric that they use and employ in their essays. Now it's subtle in some places, don't get me wrong, but for a base commander then in uniform to push out the same talking points that say things, for example, to these troops who have sworn this oath. I know you've signed up to support and defend the Constitution against its enemies, but did you know the Constitution is really just an evil framework to establish white supremacy in the United States? I mean, talk about a great way to sow the seeds of division at a U.S. military base for a senior leader to say that to the troops. So why don't you all go home and do your homework, and when you come back on Monday, I want you to bring examples of the ways in which you've abused people of color in your life. If you're white, if you're black, I'd like you to come back and tell us ways um, that you've been abused, and let's have a serious conversation about this. Those kinds of things, first off, is not what our military is meant for. If ideologues at the university campuses want to try and get into some of that stuff, I suppose that people can go into debt to be propagandized if they'd like. But when people sign up to and join the military, they expect to do a mission in support of national security and to leave all that stuff at the door. And so, in seeing that, and it wasn't just at my base, it's now a part of U.S. policy that we teach some of this garbage to our men and women in uniform in the form of diversity and inclusion trainings. And that's part of the Biden administration's policy. And frankly, it's not going to change until there's a different person in the seat. It's policy, and all of our senior military leaders just point to the policy and say, "Well, we're just teaching the policy." But it's really disincentivizing people, good people, from serving their country in uniform. It's disincentivizing veterans from recommending to their nieces and nephews and their grandchildren to serve. So it's turning into a really big problem.
Yeah. Yeah, the rewriting of history is always one that strikes me. I always wonder, I'm like, how do you not see that this is like really, you don't even have to invoke Marxism or like get people's, because you then have to, assume people's like knowledge and understanding of like what the ideology is about. But you just have to invoke like 1984, and then, well, I mean, it's a bit of a stereo, it's a bit of a cliche now, and then people roll their eyes. But that's literally what they did. That's like that's what the main character's job was. Literally
Right.
rewriting history.
Yeah, well, when I first read that book, I thought, man, he pegs it. Like, how did he get it so right? This is all happening. What's because he was living through it, right? And he saw this, and so it wasn't necessarily prophetic. He was just being descriptive of how this stuff works. And why it's so critical that they always go after history is because you can't properly orient yourself in the present moment, your place on the world stage, in your tribe or your country, without an appreciation for some of the real struggles of history. And admittedly, there's different ways to tell history, right? I mean, people can bring a different bent to the telling of history, but one thing that's clear is that if you've been trained to see it properly, there is a line that can be crossed where it's abundantly clear that someone has a very particular aim in mind in their telling of history, and it's simply to tear down, to criticize, to call into question everything in the hope that it might be torn down or burned down, as they'd say often. And there's been a lot of that, unfortunately, now in the U.S. military, and it's not. Sometimes I hear from some people, "Well, I haven't seen this. Isn't often." It's not often that this happens, but sometimes I've heard people say, "Well, I haven't seen in the military what you're talking about," and I say, "Well, that's great. I'm glad to hear that."
Yeah.
It's not everyone's experience, but good. I'm glad you haven't seen it. It's either because you need to wake up a little bit, or because genuinely you've had a great experience in the last couple of years at the base you've been assigned to, and that's good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's nice to know it's not blanket coverage. Yeah. I think what drives quite a lot of, I think possibly the way that a lot of this sort of thought has entered like the military, and then like our wider cultural, like political conversation more generally, is because of, you said there, it's like it's a we have to tear things down, like that's what the goal is. And unfortunately, I think a lot of our institutions have become like degraded and lost touch with their original purpose and become completely like corrupted, whether that's because of like corporate influence or just bureaucracy, or there's a whole bunch of reasons that our institutions are sort of crumbling, and there's a lot of irreverence towards them, and like rightly so, and it makes it easier for that sort of thought to sort of make its way through society, and we can decide that, well, it kind of sucks now, so let's just burn it all down and start again.
Yeah, I think those things that you've mentioned are all a part, they're all factors in this equation. And while I was writing about Marxism, of course, I'm not under any illusion that that's the sole um, driver of the troubles that we face. Although it's, in my view, a very big part of what's happening. It has a lot of explanatory power. For example, in the university setting, in the academy, um, is predominantly where critical thought or critical theory originated. I mean, it was nearly 100 years ago with Marxists who had as their aim the disintegration of the fabric of Western society, its government, its legal system, its cultural integrity. And so, how is it that we affect, this whole poor, suffering middle class thing? This narrative really isn't going over well in the West. How do we solve this problem? Well, there's other narratives we can seize upon to drive the same wedges between people into different groups and tribes. And racism is an excellent one in this country. There's a famous black economist, Thomas Sowell, who's quite famous. I'm going to get the quote wrong, but he said, racism isn't dead, but it is on life support, and it's kept alive by race hustlers and politicians who stand to gain by keeping it alive. And so the Marxist, too, uses narratives to its advantage to divide people, because that is a part of the aim of tearing down the incumbent system. So how does this infiltrate the military? Well, people. And, the military for some time has placed a tremendous emphasis on getting its senior military officers better educated, higher education, advanced degrees. And so they spend a significant amount of time in the institutions of higher learning. And while they're there, they're exposed to a lot of this thought. And also the military, to a large degree, is simply a reflection of broader American society. And society's been slouching towards Gomorrah, to use the phrase of the late Justice Robert Bork. That he has a book by that title, which is quite well done. And I think social media helps push this along, and helps these ideas gain traction. Mainstream media, which is bought, helps these ideas gain traction. And the policy, as I mentioned, of the current administration helps these ideas gain traction. And oh, by the way, if you have a diversity and inclusion centric hiring policy, then the people that you're hiring to positions may have a particular freakish kind of bent to their social or political worldview that's nearly religious in nature. And they're going to hire and attract people to them of a like spirit and mind. And so this grows even when decent people are speaking up, trying to draw attention to some of the problems. And so when people teach about it, I'm often asked the question, are we making any progress in solving these issues? I say, well, we're certainly waking people up to the issues. But the problems need to be solved not just by people being educated. We need to change policy as well, and have certain of the right leaders in place as well. It's a hard problem, and it takes time.
Yeah, definitely. So one of the things that really kept hitting me while I was reading the book, or I've been reading the book, and it's that the military itself, is obviously incredibly hierarchical.
Mm-hmm.
And that is just so antithetical to everything that Marxism stands for in a sense. And there's that sort of really strange contrast that these ideas are they're being pushed within a structure that just should outright reject them. Especially the people serving within it, they should be thinking there's no way that those two worldviews should be able to collide. It's yes, I'm gonna partake in this very structured hierarchical system, where you take orders, that you're deferential to command, and I'm also at the same time going to be saying that in all relationships there's nothing but power and this oppressor versus oppressed narrative. And it also strikes me that the way this is like infiltrated society in kind of the way you mentioned, in the fact that like the media are bought, and this is all very like corporate trendy with their like DE&I training programs and the ESG scores, and you know everything to be, you know, pro woke. Like that's the, you know, the corporate drumbeat at the minute, essentially, in a lot of
It
ways,
is.
and that is totally antithetical to to Marxism, as because private corporations wouldn't exist in the communist state, which, like, you know, as you laid out, like,
Mhm.
as the ultimate goal for the ideologues. Like, how do you think that these contradictions can all exist without, like, I don't know, somehow confronting each other?
Well, one thing that's of note from a practical perspective in the military, to your point about the hierarchy that exists in the military, there is a chain of command in a military organization. There are enlisted troops, there are officer troops, and that's how typically it works in our main branches of the military. And one thing that's manifested as a consequence of teaching some of this stuff to the troops is that I've seen videos go viral on TikTok or Twitter in the past couple of years where some young troop is unwilling anymore to be told what they should or shouldn't do by senior leaders. And they will allege that it's just because they have a status of privilege, or they're an oppressor, or it's because of my race that you're telling me what to do, which is absurd. And in fact, commanders have to be able to tell their troops within legal and ethical boundaries what it is that they should and shouldn't be doing in pursuit of the mission that they are supposed to accomplish. And so, boy, it is a tough balance, especially for a young man or woman in uniform who's aware of the difficulty that these ideas are posing to the military workplace. To it's a difficult needle to thread to learn how to properly, respectfully stand upon your values or your principles, and to speak up and say, there's something about what's happening here that I don't appreciate, that is against my values, that I think is dividing us, and to do it in a way that is respectful of your chain of command, because you don't want that to break down either. And so that's one of the reasons this is so dangerous for a military that thrives in unity and cohesion. Everyone does the same mission, regardless of their politics, their race, and that's the way it's always worked, because you show up and you say, well, hey, you and I are very different people, but we're willing to go fly on each other's wing and die and kill for each other. And that's what matters the most. And instead, it's like, let's take a knee just one more day and talk about sensitivity and how we can treat each other more inclusively based on which tribe we happen to fall into and how many intersectionalities we happen to have. All of that starts to really piss people off, quite frankly, and creates bitterness and resentment. I mean, it doesn't take much thought, if people have not thought about this, to figure out why that is, if they've not experienced it already themselves. And so, yeah, it's a paradox a bit that in a hierarchical institution like the U.S. military, this kind of thing even gets any ground, makes any headway. But again, I mean, you know, when these kids aren't in the seat doing whatever mission they do, they're sitting there looking at their Twitter account and their TikTok account, and they're being fed information constantly, bombarded with certain ideas. They get together in small groups. At my base, they got together, and of course, and certain, you know, the chaplain is having black only firesides to help them figure out how to deal with white supremacy on the base, as if it existed, and I'm sure it didn't. Because I was a leader on the base. If it did, it would have been squashed instantly and someone would have been fired and kicked out of the military. But there's these narratives that they built. It's like, well, watch out, because there's certain groups here that are out to get you and hurt you. So let's meet together to their exclusion, and let's talk about how we can solve the problem of the other. And here's a critical point I want to make, that it's probably useful for people to begin thinking about this woke moment that we're seeing all about us as a kind of religious revolution. Okay, and I say helpful because let me characterize it in religious terms. It's an emotional and spiritual impulse every bit as much as it ever was political or economic. Okay. It tells you who the good guys are and who the bad guys are. It defines them for you, who the evil is and who the good are, who the righteous are. It tells you how to repent for your mistakes and your sins and what those sins really are. And it tells you how you can be redeemed and get in good with the fellowship or the brotherhood or the
Mm.
whatever you want to call it. And it tells you how to get salvation, not in the next life, but in this life. And it is tearing down the other, and it's tearing down the incumbent system. Whereas, say your typical, I'll say Christian instead of saying Judeo-Christian, but a typical Christian worldview will tell you that, hey, I need to sacrifice me and what is inside me and lay that on the altar. And perhaps I have some hope of contributing properly to the civil society and serving other people. And they do all of that to make this world a better place and hopefully get some reward in the afterlife. Well, all this godless wokeism says is that no, 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 you're okay. You need to be included. You've got merit too, despite all the crap that you're wading through, and it's the other person that's the problem. And so through a little bit of abuse and coercion, you can get them into your camp, and maybe we can even formulate some policy in the meantime that makes them all have deference to your to your way of thinking. It's utterly backwards. It turns everything on its head, and it's religious in its fervor and its insistence. It's a kind of I mean, there have been violent religious pursuits in world history, and this
Yeah, a
is not
few.
unlike those.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's like politics and religion, they
Mm.
divide people, and this is very political and religious.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you think that the growth of these ideas is a result of or the cause of like the declining amount of religion within society or the increase in
Mhm.
secularism?
I think it's both.
Okay.
I think that adoption of these ideas is a direct consequence of the vacuum that's left when people abandon. Um, I'm going to try and be as broad, generous, and generic as I can be. When people abandon the religious worldview, um, because people crave meaning and purpose, and this kind of, I mean, this isn't just a hollow philosophy. It has a moral imperative to it. It's ideology, and it tells people what to do to be more righteous, like I said. And so then they have meaning again, they have purpose, and they've joined a fight that helps them realize they're actually making a difference, whether or not it's a good difference. And so, yeah, I think it comes in direct consequence of the abandonment of God. I'll put it that way more specifically. And I also think that the reverse is true. That the more people pursue this, the more angry people get. Even if they don't want to participate in it at all, it's so easy to have the angry emotional response to all of this nonsense that we see, and that's not good for society either. And it makes people, when people become filled with anger and hatred and emotion, and are willing to potentially use violence against other human beings. Um, you're watching the decline of nations happen right before our very eyes. It's always easier to see in retrospect, but that's precisely what's happening. And in religious terms, it causes people to lose the spirit of God, which is the spirit of freedom, as the New Testament says. So I'm inclined to think they go hand in hand.
Mm. And but on the flip side of that, I don't know if you've seen
Mm-hmm.
this, but I've seen the past, especially the past 18 months to 2 years, like a I don't know if it's a more vocal or like a growing number of people like making the opposite journey. You know, from
Oh
having
yeah, great point.
yeah, I like do you think that's a strong enough countervailing force?
A good question. You know, there's that saying that there are no atheists in foxholes. It's this idea that, like, in the terror of the battlefield, men will come to God. And there's something so awful and dark about what's happening about us that it is waking people up. And frankly, it's reawakening a spiritual side of some humans that maybe had put it off for a season. And I think that's good too. And that all works this way. I mean, it's supposed to be that way. Um, And you're right, there is a balance. And I failed to mention that. I think, there's speaking of esoteric traditions or the ancient occult or something like that, in Hermeticism, there's this belief that there is this essential tension, the principle of polarity that exists. There's an opposition. There's a counterbalancing force in the cosmos. It's certainly true in this world. And it's not just a physical principle, it's on all planes of reality. It's spiritual, it's emotional. And so if there is a darkness rising, you have to trust too. And I think you can observe this, that there is a counterbalancing with light, goodness, genuine goodness, people trying to do the right thing in the face of hard times. And there's a saying something about that. I won't get it right, but people have heard it before. It's like the terrible times make strong men, and the strong men make better times, and all of that kind of thing. And I think that there's truth in that, because when darkness rises, I think that some human souls will rise up and meet that with light and truth and goodness, and with valor, and with courage, integrity, even with patience, which is, I think, desperately needed now. But despite how desperate things look, that's a great point.
Hmm. What gives you the strength? Maybe is the maybe not quite the word, but like, what makes you decide to be one of those people?
Well, I'm glad you didn't say what gives you the hope that this is going to work out. I was going to say I didn't say that, but well, strength. Probably, there's physical strength. People work hard at that. If you, I was just at the gym before I came here to interview you, and I see people in there slaving away, so to speak. Those terms are taboo these days. They're working hard in there, and they're trying to forge muscle, and they know that it doesn't come without effort. And I think there's a parallel there in the psychological or spiritual sense, the mental strength or fortitude to pursue a resistance of darkness, or to try and be a person of integrity, comes with a certain, it usually isn't just gifted flat out at birth. I mean, people acquire that through effort, and also through the right kind of mindedness, mindfulness, through a study of ideas. Because who can have courage in the face of ideas if they themselves aren't certain of certain things and can't stand on their own 2 feet? I know a lot of military men and women who have physical courage and are willing to go die for their country, but when they're confronted with an ideologue on the stage, they know something isn't quite right about what they're hearing, but they're not going to stand up and say something because they don't know how to articulate an opposing view. So how can you have courage to stand up and say nothing, right? So I think there's an effort that has to go into that, and I think knowledge is an important part of that.
Hmm. Yeah, that is. I think that's I think a skill that's becoming, and in the same way that you've talked about things like TikTok and Twitter or YouTube being a vector through which like these ideas spread, like just as we talked about, I think there's a countervailing force in that there is viral clips of people shutting down this kind of ideology, whether that's with like really well articulated like philosophical points, or whether that's sometimes just with simple reasonable questions,
Right.
in many cases.
That's
And
right.
so I think that is becoming something that people are like better armed with the language with which to refute that some of these ideas now, whereas they may not have been, say, like 5-10 years ago when these things first started to like propagate.
Yeah, you brought up such a good point, and it's something that most of us just aren't good at, and it's asking questions. Even if you don't think you have all of the answers, make someone who's imposing a worldview on you explain themselves. And that takes a little bit of courage in of itself, because it's uncomfortable for us in the face of something that we seem to maybe blatantly disagree with, to say, what do you mean by that? And then let them talk a little bit more, see if they know what they're talking about. And then if something doesn't quite sit right, say, I don't understand that. And that takes humility, or a kind of willingness to acknowledge, I've never thought about this, but I'm curious to hear more about your view about it. So help me understand, help persuade me that that's a valid way of looking at things. And maybe in the course of that dialogue, we can actually realize some things and learn some things ourselves that we'll actually be able to articulate in that dialogue. Now, most radical activists aren't interested in dialogue, but this is especially helpful if you've got friends or family that seem to have a very different view than you. Ask questions and see where it goes, and maybe both of you will get a good laugh. I've seen quite a few people break down the moment they're asked any questions, and they say, "Well, the fact that you're questioning me means you're a bigot." Okay, well, that's the end of that conversation. Like, clearly you don't have any depth, and it helps. It helps. And so ask questions. Yeah,
Yeah. And I also find that sometimes people's actual view is far less extreme than the sort of one liner that they've got off of
that's
Twitter.
right.
When you like actually break them down, they're far more reasonable than their initial statements may seem.
Oh, that's a great point too. And we're good at parroting what we hear from others. And so even if, there are genuinely decent people who really believe in the idea of including all others. They've got a much better heart or soul than you or I, let's say, and they're really good at that. And so they're so susceptible to some of the current talking points. And they're like, yeah, like I really don't like all this trans activism, but I want to be inclusive of everyone and like have them find their place in the world. And so they're victims,
Yeah,
and having dialogue with them might be a lot easier, in fact, and you might find a lot of common ground.
yeah, yeah, quite possibly. So since we're like zooming out a little bit, we can get onto space. Since yeah, you were a Space Force commander, I believe. Um, the Some of the things you talked about on your interview with Randall Carlson. So I mentioned
Mm,
that I thought it was really cool that he was your first interview
hmm
once as the first guest on your show. And the reason that I find it really interesting is because immediately after sort of laying out like your reasons for writing your book and what you wanted to do with the podcast and talking about your beliefs about Marxism's infiltration in the American military. Like the first thing that you chose to do was then go and speak to a guy who's interested in Earth as like this tiny little vessel on a cosmological like
hmm
scale. Um, I thought was fantastic. Um, so is that something that was like encouraged within the Space Force, was to try and think about Earth's position within like the solar system and the wider universe, or was that just something you sort of went off and did yourself?
Is that was on me and not something that the Space Force encourages. Uh, I want the Space Force to think about space in that way, and they're uniquely in a position to consider things outside of terra firma, unlike the Army or even the Air Force or the Marine Corps, the Navy. I mean, they're all stuck in water and on land and in mud. And Space Force, while we operate in a ground-based operations center, we're using capabilities up in low Earth orbit and medium Earth orbit and geosynchronous orbit and highly elliptical orbits. The Space Force, by and large, has taught its its guardians, that's the name of our Space Force personnel, to think about those orbits. Those are all very close to the Earth on the even on the solar system scale. Because NASA is interested in exploration and science, and specifically in things like cislunar space. Now you bring the moon into the picture. And the private sector, people like Elon Musk, are interested in Mars and Martian space. Now you have more and more interest from some of those personnel in the Space Force in the moon and in Mars, and maybe even in between Mars and Jupiter in the asteroid belt. Well, I met Randall Carlson, and he was talking about near Earth asteroids and planetary defense and the transition from the Pleistocene to the Holocene. And I was already very interested in that stuff. And he knew I was Space Force, and I knew he was into that. And so we had something to talk about right away. I tried to get Randall to come join us in the Space Force to help, talk about some of that stuff and expand the horizons of our men and women in the Space Force uniform. Never got the chance to because I was out of the seat after not too long. But that's, I spend more of my time thinking about that stuff than I do Marxism, in fact. And it's not just bounded to Mars and the moon. It's, where do we fit into things? Cosmology is of interest to me. How does the solar system fit into a galaxy, for example, and beyond? There's all these spheres of influence from the microcosm inside of you and me at the cellular level, these protons and nuclei with a bunch of electrons whizzing about in orbits, perhaps, all the way out to what we can observe overhead. And so that's all fascinating. And Randall's a good person to talk about that stuff.
Yeah, yeah, no doubt. Um, was there ever any mention of like did Space Force look at any of the asteroid stuff that he's talked about? What is it, the oh, I cannot remember the name. You know, the group he's a part of. They're watching for asteroids basically coming at us.
Yeah, there's a few different groups. There's a comet research
The
group that
Comet
George
Research
Howard
Group.
does.
That's the one. Yeah. Um,
Well, NASA has a planetary defense division. NASA, which is a government civil side of the house, not Defense Department, has more interest in that stuff than our Defense Department does. I suppose a part of that is because most of our military people, men and women in the Space Force, came out of another branch of the military, which was the Air Force. And we were thinking about other things that were more geocentric. And it'll take time to shape that culture. But also, there are some few people in the Space Force whose mission, thinking about how to say it, whose mission does bring them into contact with the folks at NASA who do planetary defense, and there's some cooperation there, and so I hope that we'll grow into that. But war and peace, the issue of war is essentially, as Karl von Clausewitz said, the extension of politics by other means. It's when words fail to do the job and diplomacy fails that violence ensues. And so the leaders of the Space Force are far more caught up in Russia and China and how that impacts what we're doing in space and how we can counter them in space than they are about what some unknown rock from deep in the solar system or from the asteroid belt might pose for us by way of trouble in the immediate future. That's kind of far. Those are not alligators that are near the boat.
hmm.
But it's so exciting, in fact, that I wish more Space Force people were thinking about it, talking about it, because it would be a great way to attract the space nerd to the Space Force where they need to be working, and it would help shape a completely unique and independent culture from the other branches of the military, I think.
How realistic is it, do you think, to look at humans as a multi-planetary species, like on a, say, like 100-year time scale?
This will disappoint some people. I don't think it's in the cards.
Okay. What makes you say that? What is your reason that it won't happen?
Well, it's somewhat related to what we've been talking about. I'll leave it at the political and conflict level. I think we're far more likely to destroy ourselves before we ever develop the technology to get there.
Oh God.
And that's a pessimistic view. Everyone's clamoring about artificial intelligence at the moment. That's one of 1,000 ways that things can go south. The sun, from an astronomical or a cosmological perspective, things completely outside of human control. The sun and asteroids, for example, could change everything before 10 more years is up. It's not uncommon for big rocks to smash into the earth. It's just been uncommon since the 1850s. And or like I should say about 100 years ago, Tunguska was, I think, 19 something, 1913 maybe.
Yeah, I think it was.
And
I
so,
think it was 17.
no, I think it was in the last century.
No,
Tunguska.
no, I mean 1917.
Oh, was it?
Tunguska event. Oh, sorry, we're both wrong. 1908.
1908. So, and the rock didn't do it, but it leveled some forests and something like
Yeah, we've
that. Well,
seen
and then
that.
we had Chelyabinsk just in the last decade. The Chelyabinsk bolide came in, sonic booms, smashed windows, injured thousands of people, and it's a small rock. So those kinds of things pose a risk not just to humans on life, but to our entire space-based infrastructure and architecture. Um, one satellite being smashed by a rock from space could ruin it for all the other satellites because of how the mechanics of the orbits work. Yeah, so and there's really, like I said, 1,000 other potential ways in which we could set ourselves back into the Stone Age pretty quick. And I think that that's far more likely than everyone keeps getting along so well that we continue to develop the knowledge, the technology well enough to become interplanetary. Even if Elon Musk lands on Mars someday, I don't think that means we become an interplanetary species. That's a tall order.
What about do you think private space exploration could see like billionaires have their own
Mhm.
colonies, like or a space
Yeah,
station
it's
or
possible.
something?
Maybe on the moon.
Hmm.
I think that's possible. That's far more likely than that humanity becomes interplanetary.
Hmm.
Space tourism, very much in the realm of possible. If we have reusable rockets continuing to be developed like Elon Musk has done,
Hmm.
and cost is driven way down, I think it's possible that humans will have joyrides to space and get to experience that. So long to the flat Earth community. Um, I think it's possible that we could set up colonies and do manufacturing and some bit of industrialization of the moon's surface. In fact, China is racing to do just that. I think it's possible that we could try and extract resources or minerals from nearby asteroids, and there are countries that have demonstrated that. So those are all in the realm of possible. But we're a ticking time bomb as far as some of the other humanity currently in the modern age is really in a precarious balance right now. And when you're in a precarious balance in a complex system, almost the flapping of a butterfly's wings could disrupt the entire thing. And so we'd just be grateful for the good time that we have while we've got it and live life to the fullest, I guess.
uh, well, both empowering and slightly depressing at the same time.
Yeah, it's we can only do what we've got the means to do. But people who have that ambition, like Musk, we should never just he can discourage himself with artificial intelligence, but I think it would be foolish to discourage the private billionaire who has the ambition to go to Mars from doing just that, right?
Hmm. Yeah, let
And
him go.
look,
Go for
did you
it.
see his launch of the Starship a couple of weeks back?
Yeah, when he was just like,
I mean, that was the biggest rocket that's launched since the Apollo mission with the Saturn V.
hmm.
It's quite the accomplishment because someone's a visionary and he's got lots of money to play with,
Yeah,
more than a lot of governments have to play with.
yeah. Oh well, more than they're willing to spend.
That's right.
More than they're willing to spend on fun things.
Yep, that's right. I don't know. That's somewhat pessimistic, perhaps.
Hmm.
But it's realistic in my view. And
Speaking of fun things
yeah,
that the government may or may not have money to spend on, what do you think these UAP things are that the Congress just had their sort of like UFO report thing coming out, and what was it? There was like 142 identified incidents or something like that. What do you think these things are?
I don't know what all of them are. I and in the same vein, I could say I don't know what any of them are.
Hmm.
But I can say that it's my view that probably the governments of the world are involved in those technologies and not extraterrestrial uh, life. I believe in extraterrestrial life, uh, but beyond stating that, whatever image that conjures up in any of your listeners' minds is a different question. I'm not responsible for that, um, but I but I do believe that there's intelligent cosmos, and that the cosmos are populated with intelligence. That we're not an anomaly. But the idea that someone might travel between star systems in a little craft that crashes into a field, for example, is that starts to stretch reason to me. And when, if you've been in the military long enough, then you get to appreciate just the smallest taste of some of what technology we worked on for decades before it ever became public. And so it's my suspicion that probably much of what we've reported on or others have reported on and what people are seeing is by way of a UAP or a craft of some kind, is a government capability. And it really helps them keep it under wraps to have the world thinking that it's extraterrestrial. But I've seen interesting things as well, and some things don't look like they can be man-made. And so you have to then wonder, is it natural phenomenon? And what kind of a natural phenomenon is that? It's not ball lightning. It's not, and what is that thing? And so I don't want to dismiss what people have seen. There's that too. I can't explain that though. I'm just an observer who's watched like everyone else, wondering at these things. And
Yeah.
so,
I was
yeah,
hoping you were gonna
that's
have
my
some.
very realistic, down to earth take on that stuff.
Yeah, I was hoping you were gonna have some
I
secret
wish I had
insider
something.
Space Force knowledge. Be like, right, okay, so really,
Yeah, yeah,
we've got an agreement with the Greys. And they are
yeah,
fighting
right.
this other race of aliens, and they're giving us technology. Um, but
Yeah, the
none of that.
Galactic
Yeah,
Federation.
yeah, yeah. Well,
Well,
I mean, the former head of the Israeli
yeah,
space, I think, was it space program? I think, yeah, former head of the Israeli space program come out and said, yeah, they're all off world. They're just waiting for us to stop fighting,
right.
right?
I guess it's not beyond the realm of possible, but I had a gal reach out to me maybe a month ago asking if I'd be willing to share with her what I knew of the secrets of the Galactic Federation.
Mhm.
And I agreed to have a phone conversation with her. I took the opportunity to not talk about, I mean, I've only encountered that. I haven't spent a lot of time looking into that stuff, but we talked about uh, angels instead and scripture. And so she wasn't expecting that. She hasn't called back asking for any more information on the Galactic Federation. And, but it's like at some point I think, well, there's some things I do believe and know about. So I can share that. But then there's the realm of speculation. And, this seems tangential, but it's somewhat related, I suppose. What's increasingly popular is the idea that the Earth is flat. There's YouTube videos about it, but more and more people are interested in that for one reason or another, and some of them have good reasons. But I have some friends that believe it, and I tell them I flew F-15s for the Air Force and we've launched things into space. I've talked to people on the International Space Station, and I've watched the Earth from 22,000 miles up in outer space. I could tell you what things look like, at least, I mean, even optically, but I used infrared sensors. And the response is usually something like this. But have you been there? I said, well, no, I've not been there. Well, then you don't know. You're part of the big lie kind of a thing. And one of the things, it's just really a curious thing to me. That too becomes a kind of religious worldview for folks who then end up believing it. And I can ask you a dozen questions that are science-based that I'd like to have someone with that model explain to me how their model explains those scientific questions. And of course, they won't have answers to those questions. But they're not interested in the logic of it. They're not interested in what their model does or doesn't do. They're interested in their newfound view and that it's helped provide some explanatory power to some aspect of their life. Let's say Genesis chapter 1, because, hey, I get it now. I can read that text in a new way. And one of the things that's done for some people is I've heard this often, I've heard it around the country, in fact. I just don't know what to believe anymore. I don't know what's true or false. That's a pretty sad state of affairs in the information age to not know what to believe anymore. And while there's very real reason that that's a problem in our modern society, it shouldn't be you or I. I mean, we've got every way at our disposal to like develop a firm mind, believe in both good science and good philosophy or religion, and then properly characterize speculation as such and reality as such, and start to work through things. And you start believing in all sorts of theories that are ungrounded in reality. You kind of lose your bearings on reality.
Mm. Yeah, I think the last few years it's been tough to hang on to to reality and sanity sometimes in many aspects. And this actually brings us beautifully full circle right at the end here. This is
Oh,
going to be
good.
fantastic. Okay, um, so we're talking about people being feeling like they don't know what to believe anymore. That they're sort of maybe a little bit lost in the information age amidst reams of information. Last thing anyone predicted, but there you go. um, and sometimes it seems to me like this, and it's been alleged by many people that some of this confusion and unknown is just a result of people's it's a result of like deliberately trying to undermine people's grounding in reality, like especially like through parts of COVID and stuff. That I saw a lot of accusations that the media were attempting to like break people or gaslight people. And I mean, I've seen some quite compelling evidence that there was at least some of that going on.
Oh, yeah.
And one of the things that I was wondering earlier about is in this ultimate pursuit of the communist state that the ideologues that we started with speak about, there also seems to be like a deliberate um, message, at least, or a line of messaging coming from the DNI ESG like corporate world, like the oppressors of the world in that worldview, in a sense. And I it seems to me that what they're doing is like laying the seeds for their own destruction unless they hope to just use whatever chaos they might be fostering to take over and become the state. So like do you
Yeah.
think that that is the likely, or that their likely goal ultimately with this?
I think there are those elite, powerful, who believe that a global state is necessary to make this world a better place. Um, I don't agree with that. But one of the ways in which that is accomplished is by the degradation of US economic and military supremacy on the global stage, because you can't bring about a new world order if the global hegemon, the United States, remains uh, in a position of influence and respect, and and so you weaken the economy and you replace it. You weaken the U.S. military, you embarrass it, you make it less lethal, less ready. That is all a part of an agenda, even if some of those furthering the agenda don't appreciate that fact. So I absolutely think you're right that they desire a global end state. It will secure for them in their own minds greater control and power and influence, and it's not out of the question that some of them believe it's incredibly important to reduce the world population in order to have a successful global state. That's not a new idea. It's ancient. It's been around forever. How we're worried about overpopulation. That's always the concern. It always has been. In fact, in writing the book, I was studying some of Thomas Malthus's writings from a long time ago, and he's saying essentially the same thing. But to your point, I believe it's entirely possible that they're sowing the seeds of their own destruction, and I don't think their plans are going to amount to what they think they will.
Well, here's hoping. Um,
That's right.
so Matt, I really want to thank you. Thanks so much for your time.
Yeah.
And people go buy your book. I'll put the link in the description. Is there anything else you want to plug before we finish?
I'm just grateful for podcasters, uh, for alternative media outlets, because they've really grown a bit in the last uh, little while, I suppose. Um, And it's important that people have a place to go and research and think for themselves and to wrestle with these ideas. So thanks for what you're doing.
Oh, no problem, man. Yeah, thanks very much.
Yep.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for making it right the way to the end of the podcast. I love that you tuned in this long. Do me a favor, hit subscribe, because 80% of you bastards are not subscribing, but you're watching my videos. See you next time.